for joining us for this installment of the Future of Work conversation. We're going to have a fun panel about big data. My name is Nelson González. I'm the co-founder of Declara, a big data company out of Palo Alto. And as such, I should remind you that GSV is using Declara as its collaboration platform. So I encourage every single one of you to get out your phones, get on the platform, and there you'll actually find a collection that we have been collaborating on. So there's content, conversation, and that is true for every single panel, keynote session that you will go to. So make sure you make use of it, declara.com. It'll keep the conversation and learning going. So we want to talk today about the role of big data in acquiring talent and in developing talent. We have a great panel of people with really diverse experts. Some of them have flown in from India and from London, so we're going to have a lot of diverse perspectives. We have Kevin Oakes, Jim Meyerle, Ron Huberman, and Himanshu Aggarwal. I won't go through their bios. That's all in your app. We're going to maintain as much time as we possible for the actual conversation. So there's a lot to talk about here, and what I want to do is structure what's going to be a hopefully very lively conversation around 4 basic themes. How does big data help us before we make a hire and after we make a hire? And then what's the what and the how around that? What problems is big data solving? Because we all know that you just put big data in front of everything and magic happens, right? And that's how it happens. Not quite. So what specific problems are we solving and how? Right? What are we solving? And then what are the technologies that are being used to solve those? And what are we learning about the kind of modalities and methodologies of using big data? So before and after, the what and the how. That's how we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so. So I want to start with Jim. Rumor has it that you managed to mash up about 500 million data points to tell us that people with criminal backgrounds are the highest performers. So say more about that. Big data, I need to hire some criminals at Declara. What do I learn from that?
Well, I think, what do you learn from that? You know, I think maybe to put a bit into context, you know, when we did that study, we did that in the context of a business called Evolv, which was a software as a service platform where we aggregated data from disparate workforce systems in order to make recommendations around who to hire, who to place with individual supervisors, who to promote, and in some cases, who ultimately you should terminate from, or you should terminate. And so within the context of that, we got data across, I think it was 13 or 14% of the U.S. workforce at the point in time we were acquired, and we were able to render some just startling conclusions out of that data. And one of those was things like that folks with prior criminal convictions for certain types of jobs, that's the important asterisk that I would put in there, for certain types of jobs, and for that study in particular, it was jobs in what's called the frontline workforce, which was, as a practical matter, that was 60% of the U.S. workforce, so it was a meaningful data set that we were looking at. But it was many other things in addition to that. It was people that had prior work experience. Actually, there's very little correlation between prior work experience and future job performance. People with prior criminal convictions don't necessarily make worse hires. The single largest driver of productivity and attrition in the frontline workforce is actually your supervisor, which is not terribly surprising. But when you can apply an econometric model against it, and you can actually determine to the actual percentage point just how likely somebody is to attrit based on the individual supervisor that they've got, it starts to get pretty interesting. And so anyway, to get back directly and answer your question, I think what that type of study shows us and what that type of thing does for us is, to me, at the most fundamental level, it is that using the right type of data and the right type of analysis and having access to the right data sets means that you can derive and uncover some startling conclusions around who makes a good hire, around who you should promote, around who you should position with and place with an individual supervisor. It breaks down a lot of biases. It opens up a lot of opportunities for people that might not otherwise have a challenging time finding work and meaningful work that they're able to advance to and build a career out of. That type of stuff.
In the context of a lot of labor mobility competition, that's obviously incredibly useful, a lot of ROI on that.
Yeah.
So Ron, I'm sure you're delighted to hear that as a former Chicago policeman, head of Chicago Public Schools, and now somebody using big data to predict what kind of teachers you want to hire. This is a great finding for you, right? You're going to go off and use it.
It's a great finding, right? Because obviously that's the company that I have, and what we do, we help school systems hire the most effective teachers. But if we think about kind of building off the context of what you're talking about, I feel like big data is on the tip of doing really well and in different contexts and phenomenally well. It's exactly these things of who to hire, right? Who to promote. Once you hire them, what's going to be their gap, right? So where do you help develop someone? And then finally, I think understanding what inspires and motivates people coming into the workforce. And if you can fundamentally, make big data small data, so you can make that super actionable down to the individual level, and you can begin to manage a workforce around these different levers and introduce through the assessment systems these layers, it's pretty compelling in terms of what the outcomes can be. We do that in K-12, and it's just an interesting statistic, right, of the things, kind of when you begin to peel the onion, like what are the things that actually make for super effective teaching? And things like cognitive ability matters a ton, attitude and disposition matters a ton, professional knowledge matters a ton, credential background matters a ton. And if you can actually aggregate those things and tell the story, you can really begin to understand who's going to be effective in a classroom, and begin to optimize the available applicant pool of teachers. And those are big levers of movement on student achievement.
And you're actually making links between those predictors and CVs and backgrounds and student achievement.
That's exactly right. We link it to understand just how well did we predict the likelihood that a teacher candidate will be effective at delivering growth. How much growth did they actually deliver? And using kind of a feedback mechanism across school systems across America to understand what is this makeup and what are the skills, abilities, and competencies that you'd want to see in a teacher to ensure that they can deliver really good academic results for kids.
Criminal background piece, not useful to you.
In a different context, right? Yeah. Useful maybe from a gating mechanism. Maybe we need to revisit that, though.
That's interesting. So this issue of validating competency, skills, dispositions before you hire is incredibly important. Silicon Valley, where I work, one of the interesting data points I discovered recently is that people developing software in Silicon Valley, we asked 70% of us who are hiring software developers asked for a bachelor's degree. And yet when you look at the job descriptions of the people that we're trying to hire, we always use the same skill sets for those for whom we require BAs and for those who don't. And so there's this disparity in what we think we're asking for, and yet we're all looking for the same things. And so that kind of disparity increases costs, increases times, because we're essentially using ineffective proxies for what we're trying to find. What are you guys learning about in terms of finding more effective proxies? I think we've heard a little bit from the two of you, but how can you help me as somebody trying to buy development talent not make the stupid mistake that I guess many of us are making?
Yeah, just to probably reinforce what Jim said about, I think what big data is helping us do is a lot of subjective decisioning, which we all thought was very subjective, is becoming a lot more objective. Hiring decisions, I think talk to 8 out of 10 HR managers and think very subjective decision, but you can use big data to actually help them slice and dice and talk about which competencies are more important, which are predicting success better, which are kind of redundant. And coming to that, we've done a lot of control studies to see that, bachelor's degree, for example, if you test for the right cognitive and skills, does not provide any incremental differentiation on success of a person. Going back to even their K-12 scores have probably better predictive power than a GPA in a college degree, from a college degree when you look at specific skills or specific jobs, and especially the entry-level jobs that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So if you look at, I think the idea is what kind of credentials could you use? And if you have alternate credentials, they sometimes are way more effective than a typical bachelor's degree. And going back to the cost of getting a bachelor's degree today, you could actually, for a lot of jobs, qualify people just based on alternate mechanisms of learning and being able to measure the success of those learnings using credentials coming from assessments or credentials coming from passive data, which you could probably collect over the internet or something like that.
If you look at the general marketplace, generally in hiring, but bringing it back to very specifically in the K-12 marketplace, I love doing a workshop called Resume Roulette. And you bring in HR directors and principals and hiring authorities in K-12, and you give them a stack of 20 resumes. And you say, rank order them in the order in which you would interview the candidates. And without exception, we've never gotten the order back the same way. So if we were to put groups, right, and then you ask people, what really matters in hiring? What do you look for? Well, someone's going to say, well, I like, this is a really clean resume. I like that they had extracurricular activities. I like their school of ed. I like. And then you ask the question, what if that is actually linked to the efficacy of their ability to deliver academic gains to students, right? And it's a massive divide. So the big data movement in hiring and assessment and thinking about how you figure out who your workforce should be in the development is still, while the tools are out there, I think the state of the art in K-12 and how we get folks to think about it is still miles apart from kind of what is the state of the art in hiring and how people think about it, and how the proxies used today have absolutely no linkage to what you're saying, to what actually matters in the workforce that you want, generally speaking.
So I'm getting all this conceptually, but wearing the hat of the consumer. So it's 18 months ago, my company raises a big Series A, largely thanks to GSV, and all of a sudden we have the mandate to scale, and I have to hire around the world. I love all this. It makes perfect sense, and I'm philosophically aligned. But what are you guys collectively providing for somebody like me? Because at the end of the day, I have a CV, I have a recruiter maybe, or I have Monster or LinkedIn, and I have to hustle. And so I don't have, this is really fun for a cocktail party conversation, but how are you solving my problem of that immense scaling that many entrepreneurs, if we're lucky, get to go through?
I think that's part of the reality of companies. It's sexy to talk about some of the great things that organizations are doing around big data and hiring. In reality, very few companies are actually doing that today. And I think the issue that we have in many companies is they don't necessarily have the skill set to combine the data that they need to make the right decisions. They don't necessarily know what to look for, and so you can see already we have different types of hiring needs on this panel, looking for very different things and valuing very different things. So it's important to look at the blueprint inside a company around what works, but then just taking the time to to be systematic about it. And I'm sure you're rapidly trying to hire, you're not being very systematic about it. I would love walking into a company to just find a number of companies who, as they do assessments and they understand the skills and the competencies and also the skills gaps in people coming into the company, that they just keep that information once they hire the person. Half the time we hire these people and we throw that information out the window, and it never gets passed along to learning and development or to performance management or anywhere else. And there are skills that people have in our own companies that we just don't even know because we haven't cataloged them in a skills database. And there may be people that speak Mandarin Chinese in the company, and as we're opening up an office in China, that would be useful to know, and we don't know it because we just don't keep it. So I think it's still a small percentage of companies that are doing a lot with big data around the hiring, and I know we're going to talk about development, but on that aspect as well.
I think
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think another important thing too on the big data piece is there are different solutions that apply to different use cases, different types of workforces and whatnot. For example, right? So like as an example, when we would look at the frontline workforce, we would play actually a somewhat similar game as hiring roulette. But with us, we would have 2,000 recruiters that were using our platform, and half of them would be out of compliance, and they would not be making the recommendations they would make. And then we would do a quarterly account review, and we would go back to them and we would show them they were all wrong, systematically that they were wrong, and the big data actually was absolutely more capable and more effective at being able to predict who was going to be effective within the organization rather than people that have been working in that organization for 10, 15, 20 years, whatever their tenure might have been in that recruiting organization. But within that was a very effective set of tools that was relevant when you were doing high volume hiring, when you had lots and lots of data available. And so I think this is one of the, when we talk about big data, which I sometimes smark about a little bit, because when I started 7 years ago, big data was like an Excel sheet where we only had 60,000 lines in it. And it was 2 monkeys, which was me and Max in a room working on it. From that standpoint, it was a very relevant. The relevant set of tools when you've got lots and lots of data that's available for you. But when you're looking for professional hires, or to me, if you're looking for teachers and whatnot, it takes for a very different type of product and a very different sort of model and a very different approach to what you're doing, because you've got to ask the questions what data sources you have available, because ultimately big data around a lot of the workforce stuff is just around like using data to make better decisions. And if you don't have that data available to you, then you can't make more effective decisions. And so it gets back to the different types of tools for different types of workers and whatnot. And if you're looking for like a CFO or a lead engineer or whatnot, you've got to have a really good quality amount of data across a lot of different similar job types in order to be able to have a tool available to you that allows you to make sense of it and ultimately to allow you to be successful at what you want to do, which is just to hire really great people quick.
Yeah. So let me play the role of a different kind of client, and that's I'm a minister of labor, or I'm the dean of a local university, and I'm actually looking at the labor pool. And I think big data and a lot of what you guys are doing is very useful at the more macro level when I'm actually looking at how to create that pipeline. Quick question, how many of us are hiring, outsourcing or hiring engineering talent from India or from Indian educated engineers? How many in the room? So Himanshu, 80% of Indian engineers are unemployable. based on their skill sets in 2015.
Right.
So I'm the Minister of Labor in India, or I'm the president of your major technical university, or I'm a big buyer of Indian talent in Silicon Valley. Where did you get that data, and what does it mean?
So if you're the Minister of Education, you would hate us, So that's the bottom line.
Tell us more about that report.
Yeah. So what we do as a business is that we go in and test millions of people in India every year on a standardized, multidimensional assessment of cognitives, language, behavior, and skills. And we use this data to both drive macro trends for the Minister of Labor or universities, but also use this data to help corporations hire effectively. You need to, I think every time when you're recruiting, and that's pretty much every hiring manager's challenge, one is about getting the right quality, but is also being able to choose from the set you have. A lot of times you get the feedback that, well, this is all we have, so you need to pick from this, and that's the reality of when you scale up quickly, for example, in India, in the US, or pretty much any part of the world. So we use this data basically to create a standard norming of how people actually behave, how people actually perform on various skill sets, and being able to slice and dice that. So the objective was, continues to be, is not only help people get jobs, but also to figure out what are the larger macro challenges when it comes to learning, as to are there challenges in cognitive skills, are there challenges in quote-unquote IT programming skills, accounting skills, and so on and so forth. So the data of 80% not being employable is actually looking at how our clients, like we work with 7 out of the top 10 largest IT companies in India, which every year hire about 200,000 people. And our clients would actually get back to us saying that these are the kind of people we like and these are the people we don't like. So typically create a benchmark for and we use that benchmark to actually transpose and see who's employable, who's not. So 80% is a good figure in my parlance, because when I go to a product company, the likes of an Amazon or Google, or some of the startups in India, that number drops to 2%. So computer programmers so the IT industry, for example, in India still is resilient to hiring people and training them on job and so on. Product companies need better algorithms, better data structures, and so on, and that drastically falls. So I think, so coming back to some of the stuff we just talked about, how can we help a particular corporate hire better, is to pretty much break your jobs into competencies and then deploy the right tools to evaluate each competency. And what we have seen more often than not is that the top 3 or 4 competencies are actually good enough to be evaluated to get you to the right set so that your subjective evaluations can kick in. So how we always look at the problem is that, use objectivity to the level that it can help you be deterministic on a certain set of competencies, and then let your subjectivity kick in. And more often than not, the success of that hiring process is way beyond. So for example, you could pick up a cognitive skill and use the right adaptive evaluation mechanism to do that, or you could pick up a customer service skill and use situational evaluations to do that, and make a combination to do recommendations. So using that, you could actually determine learning needs of people, determine macro learning needs. A lot of universities we work with, for example, actually use this data to do add-on learning programs for their students in the 2nd and 3rd year, so that they get job ready by the time they get to the 4th year. So, and what we're able to tell them is very specifically, these are the competency areas where your students are at a macro level are weak, and some of them go to the level of actually batching them in different kinds of areas and providing learning.
Ron, how different, similar is your approach to this?
It's similar in one way. So what we do is we take 100% of the instructional applicant workforce for our school system. So maybe I'll take Miami-Dade School. So 100% of their teachers apply via Teachermatch. We deliver a psychometrically scaled, nationally normed instrument to them based on all of our research. And the research all based on big data. It's actually one of the largest databases ever that associates actual student growth with specific teachers, because what we're predicting for very specifically is the likelihood that a teacher candidate will be effective at delivering academic gains. And so the teacher comes through, they take our instrument, it's an adaptive instrument that's 100 items long, takes about, the average candidate in America, about 47 minutes to complete. But when they're done with that, what we're able to do is rank order by job the likelihood that that teacher candidate is going to be effective at delivering academic gains to students. And we validate it against state value add. For those of you familiar with it, we validate against the NWA MAP assessment. But we use very clear student growth assessments to validate the instrument to say this teacher is going to deliver 1/1 or 1 year of academic gain for 1/1. Or if a teacher's scoring 65 on our instrument, we know now conclusively that by year 2 of teaching, they're delivering 1.3/1 or an incremental 3 months of academic gains for 1 academic year. And so as I think about this on a very contextual level, it's an incredibly micro-empowered process because the school system will say, okay, I've got 10,000 applicants for teaching positions. I'm going to use this instrument to figure out who are the top 5 candidates by job opening, and then it gives that principal or that hiring authority the ability to focus on those 5 candidates. Because while every context is different in the education marketplace, it's almost always a school principal in a district who hires. The average principal in America will interview 3 candidates per opening. So using big data to get the most compelling 3 candidates in front of a principal is just a massive game changer. And the last thing I'll say on this part for things, we kind of learn different things about different workforces. So what we know about teachers is that there are, like, as I said before, there are 4 things that matter, right? And inside of those, we can peel the onion and say incredibly clear competencies that matter. And the really interesting data point on it is a lot of what our data suggests is different than what some of the original research in education suggests. So for example, principals typically will hire for agreeableness, right? And if you think about it, you're running a school building, you're a school principal, right? You want someone who's going to belong in the teacher's lounge. You're going to want someone that's going to kind of play well, right? But the data is pretty overwhelming that if you are overable, agreeable, you don't make a particularly good teacher, right? And if we think about our own best teachers, right? They weren't necessarily a teacher that was the friendliest teacher, but it was the teacher that drove you and built a relationship with you and could deliver instruction effectively. And so I think the power of big data reduced to an instrument that can be delivered to a workforce and then enable people to make better decisions at a very micro level, right? In this case, I'm talking about school building principals, really changes the game on hiring, right? And what's interesting is, at least in our work, and we're in hundreds of districts, including many of the largest districts in America, is that it's somewhat of a myth, right, that we don't have enough qualified teachers, right? The problem is that we're not hiring the qualified teachers that exist in the applicant pool. And when I was in running Chicago Public Schools, this is not the best proxy, but it's an interesting one. I had 10,000 applicants for about 1,000 teaching positions. We need to hire 1,000 teachers to keep up with attrition. What I knew, generally speaking, is that we were hiring almost exclusively from teachers who are graduates from the bottom quartile schools of ed, even though we had enough applicants to fill every vacancy with teachers who graduated from top quartile schools of ed. Not that school of ed is a perfect proxy, right, but it certainly suggested a problem. And so I think big tools delivered in a way that the user can use it begins to dramatically change the equation on how school systems or hiring authorities or companies think about hiring. And I think long term it also gets that individual in a better place, because I think we've all worked in environments we all see individuals who get jobs that they really shouldn't get, and then we set them up for failure. So I think having these tools to be guidance for different positions is just a big win-win.
Absolutely. So I want to move the conversation a little bit to the post-hiring role of big data. So how do we develop, train, and incent talent? But I think this has been really useful at identifying some of the pain points that we're solving. What problems are we trying to solve? We're solving for identification and recruitment of the right kind of candidates, evaluation and credentialing of skills. We're validating whether those skills are relevant or not. Workforce planning, right? Me as the sitting in the seat of the minister, and also maybe helping job seekers locate themselves within a particular market. And we've heard that there can be outsized impacts in terms of identifying surprising findings like criminals are good in some roles, and the predictor of things like student outcomes. So super useful. I understand a little bit better about the magic of big data pre-hiring. Let's talk about post-hiring. So Jim, back to you. You reduced attrition at Xerox by 20%. What happened? How did you do that?
Well, that was primarily using, so we had a set of different modules. That was primarily just improving the quality of hire, right? So that was using a pre-hire selection product in order to ultimately make a determination around who would be best for an individual role.
So did some of the products you develop actually help with engagement? With
and then we did have, so some of the later stage stuff that we did that was super interesting was, we had a kind of a team of industrial and organizational psychologists that built assessments and measured different competencies and used a bunch of kind of theoretical constructs. And then we had sort of an analytics team that had PhDs from Harvard, and they did things like they got PhDs in theoretical physics and taught themselves to code on the side and got really into machine learning, and then we built out kind of that team, right? And so within that, we then started to build our kind of these econometric models and whatnot that allowed us to do things like actually build out like a circular graph or a pie chart where we were actually able to identify the actual specific drivers of attrition in different types of environments, right? So like, the 12% of the reason of why you're going to leave your job is because you can't work the shift. 62% of the reason why you're going to leave your job is because of your supervisor. It was pretty wild stuff. And that's when we started to look at, kind of getting to the next piece on the learning and development side, right? That's when we then started to look at, well, actually, you could cut attrition by an additional 25 or 35% if you just actually put these individual people with these individual supervisors, because it's a good competency map, et cetera, right? So that was some of the stuff that we did there. But then I think, some of the most interesting stuff that I think is sort of the next evolution in big data, if you will, around the workforce. I think a lot in the pre-hire selection stuff, it's just proven it works. Like we almost don't even have to revisit that anymore. There's such incredible data on it that proves out that it works. I think the next really exciting stuff that's coming out is around how do you build sort of micro training, and how do you build training that aligns to different competencies and capabilities that you measure as part of the pre-hire process, and how do you push information to people that they can digest in the right way in order to ultimately make everybody very, very effective employees, right? And a big chunk of that is just around delivering like really great training in the right context at the right time, relevant for your job, that's digestible. Sorry, Nelson, if I totally went off on a tangent on
No,
that.
no, actually,
that's like my view.
this is exactly where I wanted to go, because I think a lot of what's being generated by this data are great taxonomies about the supply and demand of the labor market. You've got assessments, credentials, really amazing views into the patterns of what's working. And I think that the missing link, and where we're all trying to evolve, is how that leads to learning and development. And obviously here we're broadly at the summit talking about education and learning and professional development. So I'd love to hear actually each of you, because all of you are doing work very relevant to this, but riff on how do we bridge that gap between all the insight that we're gathering and how we turn that into modular, personalized, adaptive, relevant units of content and units of assessment that can actually help us demonstrably develop some of the skills and competencies that you're all proving help us be successful. But what's the learning piece around that, and what do we have and what's missing?
I can tell you from our perspective that what we do in this particular case is by kind of having this iterative feedback loop, right? So we assess teachers, they get hired, we see how they do, we're able to get feedback data over them longitudinally. And we've got 50,000 teachers now that we have feedback data on multiple years, right, from the moment they take the assessment. And so we're able to peel the onion and figure out actually what predicts great teaching, right? And that actually matters for the training part, right? In our case, teachers who can do the following sequence and behaviors of things just absolutely kick ass with kids, right? And they deliver great results, right? They can deliver instruction, they can take a standard or concept and deliver it in a form of curriculum. Right? They can assess against student work, they can adjust and reteach based on assessment of student work. There's a whole series of things that great teachers just do. By understanding that and then being able to deliver a tool that situationally assesses whether someone has those skills and abilities, we produce what typically comes out to a very detailed 17-page report that says, okay, on day one of teaching, as you think about the induction of this teacher, how you're going to train that new teacher and help them succeed in the classroom, here's 6 areas they're going to struggle. And if you look at the professional development context in K-12, what we know from Gates and lots of other studies is that 93% of teachers self-select the totality of their professional development, right? So if I was picking my own PD, I'd probably say, I need a suntan, right? It's probably the last thing I need, right? But generally speaking, people are not very good at assessing their own gap, and they tend to opt into training of something that they're already good at. And so being able to create a system that from day one says not only, there's a go, no-go, right? Which is, are you able to, do you have the basic cognitive functioning to be effective in a position, right? Stage 2 then is, okay, if you're going to go into that position, and we know what success looks like in that position, so we can say conclusively from the data, great teachers always do these 11 things. And we know top quartile teachers kind of act, behave, do these things, and deliver great results with kids. We can begin to then set up training, right, and deliver a course of professional development that speaks very uniquely to, okay, here's how I look different from someone who's really ideal in my position. And being able to create that roadmap is really powerful, and is kind of, I think, transformative in how we think about investing in development of employees.
So I think in the context of an organization ready to receive this, that is transformative. Kevin, a recent report of yours said that 3/4 of organizations don't even know if their PD is being used. And so we can have all these tools, but yet what are as you do benchmarking and you work with many, many organizations around assessments of their organizational capacity, what's the other bookend that needs to receive this, given that 3/4 of people don't even know if their stuff is being used?
Yeah, to build on the quality of hire discussion, you can't talk about that without talking about retention. And what's very important to millennials today are learning and development opportunities. And so the report you're referring to was one we did for the White House called Upskill America. And it was looking at the frontline workforce and what's available to that frontline workforce. And today, many organizations offer a variety of educational opportunities to that workforce, yet those workers don't know about them. The company doesn't track who goes through them. The company doesn't communicate about those opportunities, and so they go unused. And there are a few companies that really stand out in that regard. Walmart, believe it or not, is one of them. Walmart promotes 75% from within. Many of the senior executives started on the front line at Walmart and worked their way up through the ranks. And so they put a lot of focus on getting your GED if you don't have that, on getting your 4-year degree if you don't have that when you join Walmart. They've partnered with American Public University. It's a widely publicized program that they're using, and that's been very, very successful for them. All of it's designed for retention. When you're in that kind of environment, you've got to hang on to the good folks, and I think they're using L&D very effectively for that.
One thing to add to this too that I think is super interesting is I think a lot of what we see on learning and development and whatnot has been around, sort of you do a study, you offer a course that's been created over some period of time, you deliver, you get some additional data back, you sort of do an analysis and you deliver it back. I think some of the stuff that's starting to get super interesting, and like I'll use as an example one of the investments that we've got with my current business is, it is a true example of building a product around big data and learning development, right? So you go in and you turn the product on, you slurp in your calendar data, you slurp in Slack and email communications and other data sources. You then are able to pull in all the data that you've got from learning and development, you pull in your data from your succession management and whatnot, and it spits out to you materials that are relevant for you if you're going, so as an example use case, if you're the largest consumer products business, one of the third largest consumer products business in the world, you've got 20,000 field sales employees that are going around. Before you go into an individual sales interaction, it spits out to you materials that have been proven to have an impact on the sales interaction that you are about to have, and where you're able to improve the quality of those materials based on feedback that you get from those salespeople when they come out of that interaction. To me, that's when this stuff gets super interesting, because that's when you're actually like one of the challenges with all this stuff is how do you cut down on cycle time, right? How do you get data in quickly do an analysis on that data and then use that in order to enable improved business outcomes or to drive improved business outcomes. And if you can build those models that you can pull data in really, really quickly and then spit out things with a tangible product around them, to me it's a game changer on a lot of this learning and development stuff.
Himanshu, you're doing some work on tagging instructional objects to some of this labor data. Say more about that.
So the way the problem manifested for us was that you had a lot of people who wanted jobs, and the current education system as it's designed is unfortunately no longer geared one-on-one to, okay, I study this and I get this job. So, and it's getting, kind of getting further apart as we say, and that's why there's so many ways of alternate learning. So what we were trying to figure out was that, let's say that someone, 80%, right? 8 out of 10 people are not going to get a job because they're just not ready. So I think there are two things which we're trying to figure out. One was how far are they from a job, from a particular kind of job, and what kind of learning can get them that distance. So there was learning which might be apt but would not get them the distance. There was learning which isn't apt for them at all. And for that, what we tried to do was using all the data we have from corporations on success of people and ideal success profiles, we started translating that into a job taxonomy. For about 900 unique job roles, we kind of defined what kind of skills are required and at what level and what's the importance of this skill in this job. And using that, we could pretty much, anyone who goes through an assessment of ours could match them to jobs and say that, okay, these are the skill gaps for you to get to this particular job. And then look at, tagging any kind of learning. So today we tag a lot of, Udemy courses, edX courses, Coursera courses to this skill set or taxonomy of competencies, and try to, and I think it's I think that's the next part of big data for us. As people start taking it, doing these courses or endorsing the needs, we can actually go back and see how well, we can actually measure and see how well this particular course is improving this particular competency, keeping in mind the other variables of their cognitive abilities, their language abilities, to be able to gain these skills. So that's worked fairly well for us. Specifically, if you could be targeted to specific jobs, we've seen that that has some great results.
Great, so you're solving a lot of problems for me post-hire by helping me engage my employees, and then a lot to be said about this learning potential and what we're about to unleash in terms of personalized PD. So great, I'm getting some of the problems that are solved there. So can't have a panel on big data without doing a little bit of technology geeking out. So we should talk a little bit about back-end architectures and analytics. It's evident that the level of insight that we have now would have been impossible just a few years ago. So say a little bit about what you guys are most excited about in terms of what you've built, what you're building technologically. What is it that this revolution is enabling you to do right now, and how are you doing that, right? So let's move into the how part of the conversation a little bit. What's going on that's exciting you technologically?
To give from what we do in the K-12 setting is if you look at kind of tipping points in K-12, so this idea that you're going to have, so to build a human analytics tool that's assessing whether someone's going to be a competent teacher, right? So using this big data concept for K-12, you need several things, right? If you think about it, you need some kind of good growth measure, right? You need that growth measure associated with students. You need those students associated with a specific teacher over a window of time. And in order to get a big enough N to do it on scale and draw really meaningful conclusions, you need really big numbers, right? And it's really in the last 5 years, it's an incredibly new phenomenon, that we have clean, robust, good database that associates specific teachers with specific students that can tie their growth back to the teacher, right? That gives you that big pool of data to now be able to analyze and to validate the items and the theories that you have about here's what makes effective teaching. You need all of those data points that come in. And so as we think about it, I think the back-end technology, engineering, analytics is actually surprisingly simple, right? The complexity is how you link the data sets with efficacy, right? And then how you do feedback loop, right? So then once you do that, how do you actually know that what you predicted is what you wanted to predict, and it's what's playing out in your workforce? And so in my experience, the technology part of this equation is really easy. The data inputs and the sign around what data, how do you get it, how do you track it, how do you link it, is the real complexity in this equation. And in the general big data human analytics space, I'd argue if you think about a world where 3.0 is nirvana, right? We're at like 0.1, right? Because 1.0 would look like people are informing their hires, generally speaking, using big data. 2.0 is they're now using not only that data, but they're using feedback data to drive what they do. And then 3.0 is they're managing how their workforce gets promoted, hired, motivated, inspired as 3.0, right? And so the technology around that, if you get the data points, is really easy to deliver. Getting the right data points, super complicated.
So you're saying that we're not ready to use data analytics for organizational performance? I recently read a report by Raytheon that said that 74% of companies use LMS reports to manage performance sort of predictions. I mean, it's fine to use those for some parts of learning, but that's an interesting data point. And that, plus what you're saying, speaks to the fact that maybe technology is not ready to actually help me manage my performance instead of my basic learning. Is that the case? My
opinion is, the answer is yes. I think systems can be ready to do that. I just think if you look at the current state of the state, and then if you look at the current state of the state, here at K-12, right, in education in America, it's even worse because data is massively disaggregated at a building level. You don't have the competency in most districts to invest in the data science and the research to effectively use that data. And you don't have centralized hiring where, generally speaking, it's easy to deliver an instrument for assessing a candidate pool. And so all of these things have complexity in all workforces. I think, unfortunately, they have the potential to be more aggravated in a K-12 world in the US than they do in other industries.
So our research on corporations shows that twice as many high-performing organizations, as measured by revenue growth, market share, profitability, they are using predictive analytics for strategic workforce planning and for organizational effectiveness. And some of those companies are doing it in very creative ways. From a strategic workforce planning perspective, many of those organizations are looking at, if we're going to expand globally, where are we going to get the best talent? How are we going to retain the talent that we currently have? And then more importantly, where is the leadership going to come as we're expanding? Others are using it for specific programs. I'll give an example of Intel, and we do a lot of work with the data analytics folks there. Their CEO about a year and a half ago at CES made a statement around diversity and said that by 2020, our organization is going to reflect the populations that we work in. And he put $300 million behind that statement, Sam, and pledged that amount of money to it. So the analytics team went off to figure out, okay, how are we going to get there by 2020? And it became very clear, we're not going to hire our way there by 2020. There's, we have very low attrition as an organization. And so there's a number of things that we've got to do in order to try to meet this pledge. And so the data analytics team has been very systematically giving reports to senior management at Intel about exits, about promotions, about demotions, transfers, as well as hiring to try to meet that diversity goal. And I think that's a great example of a company that's got a real goal in mind, but using some predictive analytics to showcase how are we going to get to this goal.
So just to close out the conversation on the how piece of technology, Jim, you built some really sophisticated stuff. Do you agree with Ron that the technology is pretty basic? We have what we need. It's more a kind of receptivity, human capacity to do something with that. That's the key. Or are there some technology pieces that you think excite you?
Oh yeah, well yeah, the technology is commodity now. It's super easy. So that to me isn't the big data piece is not difficult. It's the data sources. It's getting the data sources in. It's cleaning the data. It's having end buyers that are ultimately receptive to what they're seeing and they believe. So
let's talk about data sources, because I think one of the most interesting things about big data for this kind of analysis is that we can now mash up structured and unstructured data. So we can take LMS and traditional human capital management system data and bring in census data, and I think one of you used gas price data, and we can do social network data to actually create a much more rounded picture of the person and his or her environment. So say more about that mashup and the opportunities and problems of doing that.
Yeah, I think there's some of the obvious stuff around like privacy and whatnot, right? Depending where you are.
Let's talk about privacy in the data panel.
Yeah, that's important, right? But yeah, I think again, I think it all goes back to how much data you can pull together. I think one thing if you want to, if you do want a geek out statement, I will give you a geek out statement. To me, the geek out statement is when we can get to the point that people can actually take the data around their performance on the job with them. I think that starts to become like really incredible. Like if you just imagine a world where, at the most basic level, you can take like your reference information, right? You can get like a reference, and references are always like super duper fuzzy, right? But like, or not always, but in some, that's a broad statement, but in some instances they're fuzzy. But if you can actually take like, the data on like, here's who you performed well with with respect to supervisors, here's what types of jobs and what types of roles you performed well in, here's what you did well, what you didn't do well, and you can like take like pretty deep level of information, you can kind of like put it in like a job wallet type of thing, and you can like take it to your next employer and give it to them, and then they can better understand you and understand how to better interact with you and whatnot. Like that is a world that we'll get to, and then it'll all be just robots that'll be doing the work.
So
just portability leads to the singularity.
So an interesting example, around data source, and it's awfully hard to get data, especially outcome data in the space we are. For finance, for marketing, outcome data is pretty much obvious, right? The systems which generate the data also throw out the output data. So what we, for example, did was we used LinkedIn data to look at employment outcomes. So we said that, look, there are a bunch of people we assess, and they eventually get onto the platform at some point of time, and you can track their career and how they've been doing. And interestingly, we could also look at anecdotal salary information based on how trends are at a particular organization. And we could actually do a lot of studies around controlling certain parameters and seeing how people were performing based on the data on LinkedIn. So I think, coming to your point, there's a lot of passive data around, and I think the final evolution for data source in this space would be the passive data of how people have, for example, your references are also on LinkedIn, your So it's very interesting to see how you could use some of the data. For example, I'll just give you one quick example. What we did was we controlled for our test scores and saw what was the difference between the career of someone who passed out, graduated from a tier 1 school vis-a-vis from a tier 2 school. And we saw that when you control for the scores, there was a salary difference of about 17% for up to 3 years when basic inherent capability was the same for someone who passed out from a tier 1 school was a tier 2 school. Tier 1, tier 2 school definition subjective. So, and it probably takes about 7 to 8 years to bridge that gap. But I think using some of those external sources of data, you could potentially build models which could help you, get over some of these data challenges. Yeah.
So opening statements are not allowed in summit panels, but I'll take the liberty of asking you for a closing statement. So the summit's done an amazing job of bringing together, I think, the full ecosystem that's required for learning innovation. There are probably like a third entrepreneurs, a third educators, and a third VCs, investors here. So I'd love in about 30 to 45 seconds for each of you to basically make a pitch. If you have a room full here, equally represented across those domains, what's the thing that you most want to do? What is the thing that if you said, this is a room full of people ready to jump on your bandwagon, and they've got entrepreneurial spirit, they've got the feet on the ground experience, and they've got lots of patient capital for you. What's the one thing you want to do in 30 seconds? Kevin?
I'm a research organization, so I'm not selling a product here. But from a research perspective, what we get excited about are top companies that we can benchmark against, and we can look at what's working in these top organizations. How can we help low-performing companies, understand what they should be doing differently with their people and using data analytics effectively against those top companies? I just read a report that 80% of CHROs will be valued in the future by their ability to use data with people. And in my opinion, that's the ticket to respect for human capital in organizations. The more that they can be using descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive analytics inside their organization to help drive strategic decisions, the better.
Great. Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would pitch to how we can, there's a lot of people that run learning and development organizations, how to think very broadly and creatively around how to really change the learning models that we have, right? And a big chunk of that is how do we create learning that just really, I mean, it's pretty simple and stupid in some ways, but like, how do you just create learning that actually works, right? And that a user comes back and says, I learned something there and I loved it, and and you ask me after I've had a good night's sleep and a couple beers and I remember it the next day, there's a lot that will happen with new technologies to do that better.
What I'd say is, going back to the K-12 theme is that fundamentally, whatever else we think we know about education, if we could do 3 things right, we'd dramatically improve things, right? Which is, we'd hire the most effective teachers we could. We'd understand what that means to be a really effective teacher. We would support those teachers and invest in their development, and invest in their development in a way that speaks most uniquely to where they need to improve. And we'd figure out which of those teachers would make great building principals. If we could just do those three things, right? There's not a great school in the world or America where there's not a great principal leading that school. It just doesn't happen, right? And fundamentally, when you have a great school, it's usually because you had a great principal who figured out how to hire great teachers. The problem with all of the innovation in K-12 is how you deliver it on scale. I would argue, generally speaking, that human capital big data solutions we're talking about can incredibly materially impact all of those decisions in incredibly positive ways. And if we think about a generational lever or play that's going to improve outcomes dramatically, it's got to be those 3 things.
Himanshu, your Series B is on the line. What is it?
So yeah, I think 2 things which, especially because we deal with a lot of people in education and traditional education, I think 2 things which we want benefit of doubt from them, that's, the world has changed, a lot of times, the feedback, continuous feedback is that this is subjective, this is a secret sauce, this is how it happens. There's a lot of, variability to it and can't be as objectivized as you're trying to do it. So say no to standardized testing, for example, standardized testing is evil, bad. I think 2 things which, we try to submit to everyone, technology is evolving, big data is one, devices and mobile technology is the other. And there are multiple such trends, and that is fundamentally changing what all we can do with technology today. For example, you could be doing, machine learning based evaluation of software programmers, and we actually be able to predict, even if they don't get the program right, how close were they to the logic, and pretty much in an automated way. So what we want is that the benefit of doubt, that these technologies can fundamentally make a lot of the subjective decisioning we do objective, and take a look at a lot of the problems we have in the education ecosystem in that light. I think that's going to be fundamentally valuable for us to transform what we're trying to do here.
Well, thanks so much. I feel like we should all be encouraged that such great entrepreneurs are helping us with both the what and the how in the pre and post hiring process, and clearly a lot more to be done, but we're getting closer and closer. So please help join me in thanking the panel.